everybody. This is a meeting put on by the International Socialist Organization. My name is Randy Hensley. I do anti-police brutality work in this city and anti-death penalty work across the country, and I'm also a member of the International Socialist Organization. And I think the reason that we're gathered is because a lot of us have been out in the streets completely outraged by the not guilty verdict for George Zimmerman, the racist who shot Trayvon Martin in the streets. And I think a lot of us, definitely do that. I think a lot of us know also that this isn't an isolated incident of one young man being stalked and shot by a racist vigilante. This is a systematic problem. So what we see now is we have every 28 hours a black person in this country being shot down by some kind of police or security force. And I think we're gathered here tonight, and people have been pouring out into the streets to say we won't put up with it anymore. Enough is enough. We're going to organize ourselves into a movement to make sure that that doesn't happen to any other young child or anyone. So I'm going to introduce Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, who's going to be our first speaker. A lot of people are probably familiar with Keeanga's writings. She's a frequent contributor to Socialist Worker newspaper, which we've got in the back available to people, and to the International Socialist Review, which is also in the back, which is a theoretical journal of the ISO. And she's also been herself an activist against police brutality, against racism, for housing rights for people, and a lot of other things over the years. And she's also working on a book called Rats, Riots, and Revolution: Black Struggles for Housing in the 1960s. So she's going to speak to us tonight for about half an hour. Airickca Gordon-Taylor, who's the family member of Emmett Till, who I'll introduce to y'all when she gets here, is going to come in and speak too. And then we really want to open up the conversation for what ideas people have about what the next steps are, for what some of the things that people are already organizing, and what we can do moving forward to make sure this doesn't happen anymore. So without any further ado, I'm going to let Keeanga speak. There's some water up here. I know it's really hot in here, and I apologize for that. Hopefully when the sun goes down, it'll start to cool off a bit. So Keeanga is going to speak for us now.
I can't see without my glasses, but they're fogging over. So we'll see what happens. I hope I don't say anything offensive. It took 44 days for George Zimmerman to be arrested. This time around last April, I think it was. And the arrest of Zimmerman was presented to the public as proof that the system, in fact, could work, that it was a mistake that he hadn't been arrested the night or charged with anything the night that he killed Trayvon Martin, but his arrest was a vindication of the system, proof that the system could work. But I think that we can say that the trial that just concluded last week really showed how the system doesn't work. It exposed really the racism, discrimination, and inequality that is at the heart of the criminal justice system, even in this country. Because even though it was supposed to be a trial to determine the guilt or innocence of George Zimmerman, it quickly turned into a trial of Trayvon Martin, his family, and his friends. They were put on trial in such a way that exposed the racism of George Zimmerman and his lawyers, but also of the system itself. The fact, some of the things that they allowed to be included as testimony, like having, I think it was one of the last days of the trial, having some woman who had two black youngsters break into her house as somehow having anything to do with what happened to him, Trayvon Martin, the night that he was murdered. But this was allowed. The prosecution holding up a picture, or the defense holding up a picture of Trayvon Martin with no shirt on, to say that this was the beast that confronted George Zimmerman the night that he was killed. appealing to the racism of the jury, the five white women on the jury that was impaneled for the case. This was clearly an attempt by the defense to invoke every racial stereotype in the book to try to make sense of George Zimmerman's claims to find Trayvon Martin suspicious, worthy of following, and ultimately worthy of death. And the reason, though, racism actually, the issue of race couldn't come into the trial because the judge ruled that race couldn't be discussed. You couldn't talk about or mention race in the trial because there was no evidence or proof that George Zimmerman had ever made a racial insult, had ever mentioned race. Therefore, if race is not mentioned, it means that racism is not involved in the situation, that racism is not a factor. But for most of us, we know that whether it's mentioned or not, racism is always involved in the criminal justice system, and most certainly in this case. It's why Martin was considered suspicious in the first place, because he was black. It's why the police believed Zimmerman, even though he's standing over the dead body of a 17-year-old boy. It was because Martin was black. It's why the police didn't bother to find out if anyone was missing a teenager in the apartment complex, and instead took his body and marked it as a John Doe, because he was black. And it's why it took, as I said before, 44 days to arrest Zimmerman in the first place. All of these things happened because Trayvon Martin was black, and it was assumed from the beginning that he was guilty of having done something wrong and that he deserved what he got, what this lunatic juror, B37, essentially said in her interviews with CNN that Trayvon Martin essentially deserved what he got. And beyond this case, which has sort of exposed the racism in this situation, beyond that, we know that racism pervades every aspect of the criminal justice system in terms of who gets harassed by the cops, who gets arrested, who gets put on death row, who ends up in the ranks of the imprisoned, so on and so forth. There is no way to disconnect racism from the criminal justice system, no matter what a judge in Florida has to say about it. And so that, I think, is known far and wide among African American people in this country. But every so often, a case or a situation happens which pulls the mask off of this system and exposes it for the country and the world to see. In 1955, it was the murder of Emmett Till from Mississippi, or from Chicago, who went to Mississippi and was brutally lynched and murdered by white racists there. It was shown more recently in this country, whether it was the beating of Rodney King that was videotaped and the white cops got off for that, whether it was Hurricane Katrina, where black people were literally left to drown in New Orleans, whether it was this case, which has exposed that even walking while black, just existing, going to a convenience store and coming back home is grounds to be investigated and ultimately killed by a white racist vigilante. But this discussion of the injustice that exists in this country has emerged not because there is some sort of reflection that happened within the system itself. No one in that trial, no one connected with the Department of Justice, no one has said anything about racism, racial profiling as something that needs to be reflected on in response to this case. In fact, President Obama came out with a statement that tried to turn this into a case of gun violence in the communities, as if that had anything to do with this. This was about racial profiling and what happens when racial profiling meets some crazy vigilante law in Florida that gives essentially white people the right to execute black people that they claim to be afraid of. But if there is any case that can be made that this has created a larger discussion about racism and inequality in this country, which I think that it's clear that it hasn't come because of the system reflecting on itself. It has happened because of pressure that was brought to the system, that was brought from the outside. Pressure that took the form of protests, sit-ins, and a demand initially that Zimmerman be arrested in the first place. That is why he was arrested. That is why there was a trial in the first place. Not because the system proved that it could work, but because tens of thousands of people in this country took to the streets and demanded that he be arrested, demanded that he be charged, and demanded that there be a trial to determine his guilt or innocence. But protest remains a vehicle that can transform this case from the tragedy that it is into a movement for real substantial change. And I think that that is important when we say that it still matters to fight, that it still matters to struggle around this case. It's not about the symbolism of it. It's because that there is a real moment and opportunity to create substantial and real changes as a result of this. Trayvon Martin is the face of what racial profiling turns into when it's unchecked. Trayvon Martin represents one part of that. Stop and frisk, the policy in the New York City Police Department that by law the police have the right to stop who they consider to be suspicious people. They have the right to stop them, to question them, and to frisk them. And this has meant that the NYPD over the last several years have stopped hundreds of thousands of people every year, 90% of whom are black and Latino, 90% of whom are not charged with any crime, are not found with any contraband. It means that you are essentially, if you are young, black, and male in particular, but if you are black and Latino in general, that in New York City you can be stopped at any moment, at any time, for no reason at all. That is the law that exists there. But when you combine the sort of criminalization of African Americans, particularly young black men in this country, with those sorts of laws, then you're really talking about the criminalization of an entire generation of people. And then when you combine that, criminalization and racial profiling, with laws like Stand Your Ground, you are literally giving a license to people to kill young black men. And so if you think that that is an exaggeration, I saw this study that came out earlier this week. And the thing with stop and frisk, as we see with this case, is that you just have to say that you're afraid. You just have to claim self-defense. You don't need a witness. You just have to say that, you felt that your life was threatened. And when we live in a society where young black men are criminalized and are seen as criminals just through merely existing, then you put those together and you very easily end up with what happened to Trayvon Martin. It's not an exaggeration. White people who kill black people in the 31 states with Stand Your Ground laws are 354% more likely to be found justified in killing that black person, than if they had killed a white person. Whites who kill blacks in non-Stand Your Ground states are 250 times more likely to be found justified in killing a black person more than they are justified in killing a white person. So you see how the numbers play out, that there is literally, black life is considered substantially cheaper than white life in this country. So clearly, this case and the mobilizations around it can begin to serve the basis for challenging and getting rid of these laws, which on the surface, the face of them, seem non-racial. They don't have anything to do with race. They don't mention anything about race. But when you combine them with the racist atmosphere in the way in which black people are criminalized and Latinos are criminalized in this country, you can see where that can go. And so Trayvon Martin's murder can also, beyond even that, begin to create a kind of movement that puts racism back into the discussion as a framework for understanding these injustices and inequality that exists in the criminal justice system and in this system at large. For too long, the way in which the powers that be, the people who run this country, explain these inequalities, the way that they explain why there's higher levels of poverty amongst black people, that there's higher unemployment, that blacks are in worse schools, the way that they explain it is because we don't care. Black people don't care. It's your fault. Blame the parents. Blame each individual for whether or not they make it in the society. And at no point is there ever a discussion about the society that we live in, the way that it's organized. There's no discussion about the system at all and the way that it sets up people to fail. It sets up people to be poor. It sets up people to be unemployed. And so we have to have a new movement that reinserts that argument, because too many people, for 40 years, it has been a one-sided discussion blaming black people for their own victimization. And black people accept it. It's that pervasive that black people can accept it, that the organizations that are supposed to defend our civil rights can often accept that logic, but we have to fight back against that. We have to push back against that. We have to offer a different explanation, a different argument for why the inequality and discrimination runs rife through this society. In this case, this trial is a perfect starting point for having that discussion. And what we've seen over the last several days, where literally thousands of people have come out onto the streets across the country to protest the outcome of this case, is that clearly there are thousands of people who want to have that discussion. And so, to me, the potential for a new movement against racism that is organized around real demands, the demand to end racial profiling, the demand to end Stop-and-Frisk, which they also, by the way, have talked about bringing to Chicago as a policy to deal with gun violence on the South and West Side. God forbid they actually come up with a real jobs program, stop closing schools, stop shutting down clinics. Instead, they want to bring Stop-and-Frisk, which will only bring legalized racial profiling to Chicago. But we can build a movement that centers on the struggle against those things, while at the same time bringing racism back into the discussion as the reason for the inequality that exists in this country. But there are some questions that people have that I wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk about in terms of, a lot of people recognize that these problems exist. They recognize the problems with the police, with the criminal justice system, and all the rest of it. And there's the question of, why aren't there more people out coming out to these demonstrations? I hear this all the time. Sharice, yes, I hear this all the time. And I think, it's an important question, because the anger and resentment that you experience in your own life, where, the people that you talk to at work or at school or in the apartment building or in the neighborhood doesn't match with what is actually happening. People are pissed off. It's not like people don't know that these horrible things are happening. But it can also, at the same time, because so many awful things are happening, it can feel exhausting and insurmountable. When you spend 6 or 9 months fighting to keep your school open, you have demonstrations, you have sit-ins, you do all the things that you are supposed to do to be able, to lead a struggle, and at the end, they close your schools anyway. It can feel like there is nothing we can do, that these people are all powerful. But at the same time, people don't forget that. People don't forget the experience of that struggle, that there are victories even in the midst of defeat. There are victories along the way, that we save some of the schools, that, sometimes today in Milwaukee, a white man who shot a 13-year-old black boy in front of his mother was actually convicted. And we have to believe that that had something to do believe that that had something to do with the outpouring of protests around Trayvon Martin to say that, you can't just keep getting away with these things. So there's that element. But I think also, even if, many more people are questioning what we can do than are showing up at the demonstrations, that the people who are showing up shouldn't be sort of discounted or downplayed because it's not as big as we would like for it. It's not as big as we would like for it to be. There is a growing number of young people in this country who are getting fed up, who are the ones who are showing up to these protests, to these demonstrations, and who want to fight, and who want to fight now. And we have to connect with those people to figure out where we take these different movements around different issues, the next place, where we go with that in the cities that we live in. And so just to say, related to that, that movements don't just fall out of the sky fully formed, that often, if you look at I was in a conversation with some people this afternoon about the civil rights movement and how that developed over time. If you think about from one of the first things to happen, the Brown versus Board decision, I think in 1954, and then you've got the Emmett Till case, in which tens of thousands of people came out to Till's funeral in Chicago in 1955. If you think about from 1955 until the sit-in movement began in 1960, that's 5 years. And even after the sit-in movement began, it sort of went away after 6 or 7 months, and the civil rights movement that we know it to be didn't fully emerge until like 1963, 3 years after that. So from 1954 to almost 10 years later, it took for a full-blown movement that we recognize today as the civil rights movement to develop. And that doesn't mean that that is what will happen around these cases. We have no idea. We have no idea how they will develop. But we do know from the numbers of people who have come out already, and from the anger that we know exists in the communities that we live in, that people want to fight. They don't necessarily know how or what to do, but that they want to. And that is important, because that means that people want things to be different, that there is some sort of hope that things can be different. And that is an important start, a place to work with. And I think that means that for activists and for people who want to do something and want to do something now, that we have to be both patient in terms of how the larger movements develop, but also urgent in the sense that there are things that we can do now, and that movements aren't built by waiting for the movement to develop and to build itself. It's based on what we do. Sometimes in 200-degree rooms with 40 people. That's how it's done. And so I think in terms of what kind of movement, I wanted to address this as well, what kind of movement we want to build. And I say that in particular because I think that we should be clear that we want a movement against racism that is not just include blacks and Latinos and other people of color, but that is multiracial, that includes white people as well. And I raise that in particular because there's this one thing on the internet that has been circulating in response to a familiar chant at some of these demonstrations is "I am Trayvon Martin." And so some people have taken offense to white activists chanting "I am Trayvon Martin" because of the obvious issue that if you are white, you're not Trayvon Martin and don't face that experience. And I think, in one sense, that is a healthy response that recognizes that race matters, that racism matters and creates different experiences for people in this country, as the Trayvon Martin experience clearly demonstrates. But I also think that there is something to be said for solidarity and understanding why people, are chanting that. It's not to say that their experience is the same as Trayvon Martin, but it is to say that we stand in solidarity with African Americans who are under attack. And I think it's important to say that solidarity is not charity. Solidarity is not some charitable act because we feel bad. It's the recognition that all of our struggles are connected. That in the socialist movement, there's a tradition of saying an injury to one is an injury to all, that recognizes that through unity, we stand the greatest chance of winning. Through division and not standing up for one another, we stand the greatest chance of losing. And it's no coincidence that through solidarity and unity and struggle that can produce victories, that in the civil rights movement, that the victories around civil rights struggles in the South helped to spur on the anti-war movement, helped to spur on the student movement in the 1960s, the gay liberation movement, the women's movement, all the movements that we are familiar with in the 1960s that make the 1960s what they were really came out of the civil rights struggle in the South. And it's important to say that unity is not established by ignoring the differences of different groups, but is really about winning everyone to taking those struggles important. And I think that basis and really trying to organize as broad a movement as possible is really important as we move forward, just because that the attacks are happening on so many different levels. It's the criminal justice system. It's the fight for housing. It's the fight for public education. It's the fight for a living wage. It's all sorts of fights that are happening right now, and we all should be standing in solidarity and supporting each other's struggles. Now, in terms of, just to wrap up here, and what I hope we can take up in some of the discussion, is that I think that there is a real opportunity, as I said before, to really begin to see the emergence of a movement around racial profiling, stand your ground laws through this case. There are some immediate actions that have been called by national organizations that we should talk about mobilizing for and supporting. Most immediately is Reverend Al Sharpton's organization, the National Action Network, has called for protests in 100 cities at federal buildings this weekend to put forth the demand that the Department of Justice should investigate whether, should actually indict George Zimmerman on violating the civil rights of Trayvon Martin, which I think that we would all support that demand. But there's also the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, the march where Martin Luther King Jr. Gave his I Have a Dream speech. The 50th anniversary of that is August 24th. And so there's been a national call for that demonstration went out a week and a half ago, but now everyone is talking about including the demand for a federal indictment against Zimmerman, but also bringing these issues of racial profiling, stop-and-frisk, and stand-your-ground laws into focus in this march. And so we should talk about how to organize a committee in Chicago that tries to mobilize as many people as possible to go to Washington, D.C., to take our demands and register them with the federal government. So I'll just stop with that before I really fall apart here. I hope that we can take up some of the larger issues I raised, but also some of the organizing next steps so that we come out of the meeting really having the beginnings of a plan for how to take the Chicago experience to Washington, D.C., connect that with the murder of Trayvon Martin so that, we know that his death was not in vain and that this really can be the beginning of a movement against racism and injustice in this country.
And we are so honored and pleased to have Airickca Gordon-Taylor, who's the cousin of Emmett Till, and she's the executive director of the Mamie Till Mobley Foundation. She's also been an activist against violence and against police brutality, against the new Jim Crow. She organized a study group about the book by Michelle Alexander that people should definitely check out. So we're gonna hear from Airickca, and then we'll open things up for discussion.
You know, like millions of everybody else, of other people across the world, my husband was like, come on, they're about to announce the verdict. The calls were coming in, and I stared at the television, anticipating the outcome. And I had been praying for a long time about this, because I actually met Randy a year ago at the marches for Zimmerman to be brought into justice, okay, for him to be arrested. And I have been praying since then, because I have to tell you, I've never been the really optimistic person that this man was going to be found guilty in the first place. So when I heard them say, not guilty, I thought to myself, wow, this is what it felt like. You know, 58 years ago, after an all-white jury deliberated for only an hour before they came back with a not guilty verdict for J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant, the murderers of Emmett Till. You know, they sold their story to Look magazine shortly after they were acquitted for his murder. And they talked about how they beat him, tortured him, drove him around, you know. They wanted to make an example out of that nigger for others in the South. And I just kind of wonder how long it'll be before George Zimmerman sells his story, so that he can exploit Tracy and Sabrina's pain and profit from the Martin's family's tragedy. This is what it feels like to witness our black brothers and sisters lynched because of the color of their skin by the KKK under Jim Crow, to now witnessing law enforcement officers, the new KKK, who feel their badges authorize them to murder our youth and our black brothers and sisters. This is what it feels like, confronted with racial discrimination in voting, as Congress attempts to weaken or even abolish voting rights in states with a history of discrimination. Wouldn't that be all of them? I'm just saying. Yes. And Congress is supposed to use contemporary data. They're supposed to use this to form the new Civil Rights, Act, the Voting Rights Act, you know what I mean? And I'm just trying to understand how they're going to do that when it mirrors the same disenfranchisement of minorities today as in the 50s. I was thinking, this is what it feels like when our black brothers and sisters fought to integrate school systems to ensure their children receive the same educational opportunities as their white counterparts. In the case of Brown versus Board of Education, it was ruled that all segregation in public schools was inherently unequal. Today, school closures are at an all-time high. The hardest hit communities are those with low socioeconomic resources, communities of color, with 54 school closings in Chicago alone, with substandard pay, inadequate resources and materials, overcrowded classrooms, lack of current innovative technology, and access to opportunities for professional development for teachers. How is this equal education today, some 60 years later? Emmett Till's murder helped ignite the civil rights movement. Trayvon Martin's murder and its surrounding injustices thrust our youth around the country into a rude awakening and weighs on the soul of Black America. There are times like these when the U.S. continues to crush the real issues affecting the lives of our Black America. Poet William Cullen Bryant said, "Truth crushed to earth will rise again." We as a people are rising and will continue to rise against this unjust judicial and racial caste system. History is repeating itself. Emmett Till, Trayvon Martin, Oscar Grant, Stephon Watts, Ramarley Graham, Alan Bluford, currently Michael Wesley, and countless
of others across the country, these are all of our sons and our babies. It didn't just start with the approved killing of Emmett Till in 1955, nor does it end with the approved killing of Trayvon Martin in 2013. There are approved killings across America. In past generations, it was the unnamed individuals, blacks that came together, shut down businesses, and economically punched back making changes. I charge each of you today to get serious, which in this room, I know we all are. Stand up for your principles, to regain and maintain your rights. And I don't know if we have a lot of young people in here today. Where my young people at? Where my young? Put your hand down. Yeah. All right.
Relative as hell.
But I just want all of our young people, you know, you hear the young people say, oh, that's the past. That's back in the olden days. You know, I know you don't like that olden days. But with everything that's going on and the points that I just shared, how can you not realize that what happened then in the past is now your present? And I just want to say, when I was on the expressway and I was caught in traffic, I was listening to WVON. And I don't know how many of you in here have heard this, but there's a witness that has come forth. You all don't know this?
No. We've been in a room.
I read about it on social media earlier, but I heard the actual recording of this witness. Trayvon's murder happened in her backyard, her and her roommate's backyard. Apparently, from the bit that I heard, because I was driving and I was rushing and it was an accident, but from what I heard, it appears that the police was very nonchalant. There were 3 little children in the house, they put them up, but they witnessed and heard and saw everything. And this lady was saying that basically Trayvon was whimpering and weeping, and he was calling for help, and George Zimmerman shot him. So it's just, there was no fight like he's saying and all of that. And she said that she couldn't imagine why they never came and called them too. The officer that night went to their home and just took a little blank statement and took it and left like it didn't concern them. And they just knew that Zimmerman was going to be arrested. So they have now come forward. This is big news. I'm sure you can find it on any social media, Google it, but there's a new witness that has now come forward. And so for me, on behalf of the estate of Mamie Till Mobley, we are yet supporting the Department of Justice's petition for civil rights case to be brought against Zimmerman. We are also standing behind all of those who want to boycott and hurt Florida economically. Now, I'm a realist. I'm a realist. Now, someone said at a rally yesterday, I just missed you, they said, stop buying orange juice. No more oranges. Florida produces oranges. No more orange juice. And I stood back like, oh my. I hadn't thought about it to that level. It just got real deep. And I'm like, ooh, no more orange juice. And so, and I started to think about how could you really impact Florida economically? And I say that because when you look at what happened back in '55 with Emmett Till and the civil rights movement, our people they galvanized the movement, and they were able to bring the bus system to a halt. You know, they hit them financially and economically. And I think the same thing needs to be done in Florida. And I had mentioned this to my family, and you know how older people are. Some of the older ones are like, oh, that's really radical. You know, can we lead a movement like that? And I'm the young, like, yes, we can do it. What's wrong? So I haven't convinced them yet, but I can speak on behalf of my foundation, and that's what we're spearheading. We're standing behind anyone who wants to boycott Florida. I love that Stevie Wonder came out and some of the other artists. And I think what's important is we have to be real, we need to be true to this. Now, people who live in Florida, they're not moving. They need orange juice. They need certain things. I know I need my orange juice here in Illinois. I'm gonna have to find another distributor, but outside of Florida. But I will say this. A realistic thing is these conventions that are going there, these companies, it's amazing that the NAACP convention is going on in Florida right now. All of the money that these major organizations take to Florida, the tourism, we can hit them hard like that. Stop going there, pass the word, stop going to Florida to hold your conventions, because it trickles down into the food industry, into tourism, the theme parks, all of that. And then stop going there and spending all our money to go see a mouse. We don't need to see a mouse. Don't go see the mouse. I mean, seriously. You know, I'm guilty of it. I was mad when I saw the mouse, though. So I'm just saying it's not even worth it. Don't go see the mouse. But no, seriously though, these are real solutions that I think that as a people across the country, we can teach Florida, and not just Florida, but we also need to help those states galvanize against who still have the stand your ground laws in those states as well. I did read recently that this is the first time that there have not been any more stand your ground laws implemented in over this long time frame. So that's a start. But you know, I'm not the person for all the solutions. I just know what I can do, what's feasible for me, and I stand on that, and I stand with others. Sounds like I missed some solutions. I'm sure Keeanga has some solutions I missed, but you know, again, I stand with everyone. This is our family. In closing, we were disappointed as a family, but not surprised. And I'll say this, my cousins who are survivors of the Till tragedy, Simeon Wright, Wheeler Parker, they have yet to comment. They're not talking on it. That's how it's really just opened up that wound for them again, and it's festering for them again. So, and I will note, we will be in DC. We will be in DC for the march.
Yes.
Now we will be out there. I know I will be posting on social media. I know the National Action Network here in Chicago has buses going. I've been told that Operation Push, they're sending buses. We're part of their breadbasket. So I do know of organizations that are, when I put it out, we didn't get enough response to do a Till bus. So we're gonna just support the others. But we will be there in August, because August 28th is not just the anniversary of the March on Washington, but it's also the 58th year anniversary of Emmett Till's murder. So we will be down there with them. In fact, next week would have been Emmett Till's 72nd birthday. And we will be in DC next week, Simeon and myself, for the March on Washington Film Fest. And we've just turned this up, like what he said, turn up? We done turn it up. We done turn it up a notch. So it's not just gonna be your regular film fest and screening talk afterwards. It's gonna be on another level. So if you have any friends or family in DC, tell them to come on out. And you can find all that information on Facebook, on social media. You can see me afterwards if you need any kind of linkage to find us. Somebody was talking about here in Chicago and how people are discussing we're killing one another amongst ourselves. And I think personally for me, I feel that a big thing is we have to start internally. You know, there's a saying that when people are sad, they cry, but when they get angry, they act. And I believe now we are talking about racism in the United States. There's discussions going on. I think what has happened, just like what happened in 1955 when Emmett Till's murderers went free and what they did to him. And let me just say this. I don't necessarily agree with all of the comparisons about the crimes. I just have to say that, because that's something that's been weighing on me. And a lot of people feel the same way. They're like, how can you compare Emmett to Trayvon? Yes, the crimes were different, but these were two young boys who were innocent and did nothing to deserve the fate of death. Now, when it comes to Emmett, he was tortured for hours. He was beaten, an axe cut down the middle of his head, split open, eyes gouged out, driven around Mississippi for hours and shown off while they were beating him. You know, so you can't compare the crimes, but you can look at then and bring it on back to now and see that the judicial system hasn't changed. And I think that's the biggest thing that's really impacting the family right now, especially the survivors. But I think we've got to start internally as well. There are several issues. You can't just pick and choose one that you want to address. We've got to address them all simultaneously. And with our kids killing one another, even right here in Chicago, maybe they'll get angry enough and the discussions are starting to cause them to think about killing one another and to get together and unify to fight a bigger force, a bigger opposition, which is the system. And so that was one thing. It was something else. Oh, I was just gonna say in closing, when you think about J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant, they might have got off free, but they never lived good lives. They all lost children at early ages, both of them. They both suffered illness from what I'm told. You know, they went broke. And see, one of the issues is that they were poorer than what our family was down there. They were dirt poor. And you had Emmett Till, who was never taught to be, you know, less than what he was. He wasn't taught to keep his head down. He was taught that he was somebody, and he went to an area, he went to a world where blacks were taught that they weren't anybody. And so that was a big problem. I think our parents, you know, and I'm not saying all parents, I don't want you all to throw stones at me because this is a delicate thing, but some of our parents are not parenting. There is no reason that our young children who are caught up in some of these violent crimes here in Chicago, why are they out in the streets at the hours that they are? Why are they in locations where they are? We've got to look at the parents. The parents, now they're worried that their child can just be walking down the street in a hoodie and be targeted. But so why is your child outside at a certain hour? You know, they need to parent. Some of our parents are not parenting. They're leaving it up to the school systems, the teachers, and the communities, and that's a big part of the problem. And I think if we work from within, addressing it a certain way internally and then bringing it out with our children right here in Chicago, that could be more effective. You know, and I just want to say George Zimmerman better watch out. You know, what he's done, he's not free. He can't put a hoodie on. He can't walk down the street. He's basically now wearing the skin of a black man. His rights, as though he thought they were, he's confronted with the same issues as my brothers. So he needs to just, you know, go someplace and hide and never come out again because his life is not his own. I mean, can you imagine him having a life now? He's not going to have a life, so.
So I thought this was a really good discussion, and not every issue, you know, we can address tonight. So I wanted to respond to a couple of the questions that came up, but then also talk about what we can do here in the coming days, not the coming weeks, but also then how do we move forward. One thing that struck me was someone talked about migrating out of, getting out of Florida. You know, the murder of Emmett Till helped to inspire, you know, the second wave of the Great Migration of African Americans out of the South into the North. And that's true, but what happened shortly thereafter, the riots that happened in American cities from 1963 until 1968 happened because people left the South with the expectation that things would be better. They used to talk about the North, the Chicagos, the Clevelands, the Philadelphias, New Yorks, as the land of hope. And the belief was that if you left the South, you would be escaping the racism, the stifling racism of the South to some sort of democracy and freedom. And what people quickly found was that coming north, that blacks were in the worst jobs that caused greater poverty, were in substandard housing universally, and were beaten and abused and humiliated by the police every single day. And the realization that, you know, as Malcolm X said, if you are living below the Canadian border, you are living in the South. Meaning that racism in the United States is not a regional affliction, it is a national disaster, and it happens everywhere. And so there is nowhere to run, there's nowhere to go. The issue is, how do we fight it here. And I absolutely agree that Chicago has its own racist regime that we have to take on. But then how do we also turn that into a national movement, recognizing that what happens here is not so different from what happens in New York, from what happens in the Bay Area, in Oakland, California, from what happens in South Central Los Angeles, from what happens in Philadelphia, from what happens in Dallas, Atlanta, and Sanford, Florida. So these are things that are happening to everyone across the country. And I think that we have to build the kind of movement that takes those issues up. And so what would that movement look like here? I think one thing that we can immediately get behind is Saturday. There's a national call for demonstrations at federal buildings in 100 cities for this coming Saturday. So who can make it? All right. So everybody who raised their hand, we should get some emails or Facebooks or something so that we can coordinate. So everybody here who raised their hand can go tell 2 people. And let's turn out for Chicago. Let's get a couple of 100 people out on Saturday that make the connection between what's happening here in Chicago, the murder of Trayvon Martin, and why we need to make this a federal issue and take it to Washington, D.C. And then after that, we should talk about, after the meeting, how do we get people to Washington, D.C. for the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. Not as a stroll down memory lane, but as a march to demand justice today. That to talk about the continuity of racism, injustice, discrimination, and inequality from then. It was a march for jobs and freedom in 1963. And clearly, in 2013, we still need a march for jobs and freedom. That is something. I know there is another meeting that is happening in Chicago on the south side at the University of Chicago tonight, where people are talking about the same things. And we should try to connect with people who can turn out folks for Saturday, but can also make building for the March on Washington a central thing that we do. So I would say after the meeting, I know people signed up on this information sheet for the ISO. So maybe one thing we could do is just send an email to people who sign that about meeting together maybe after the march or after the picket on Saturday, that those who want to then talk about how to begin to strategize to get to Washington, D.C. August 24th, maybe we could spend some time talking then and plan a more public meeting for the following week. Those are just some ideas about how to not just sort of, how to turn this into actual organizing. Because I agree with what, people have said in terms of folks don't know what to do. And it's hard to know what to do when there's not an alternative to turn to, or when there's not, something to go to connect with. And so we can provide that. I think that's important. But I also think the thing that Sharina said at the beginning is also important, that people don't know a lot of the history. People have been so disconnected from our history of radicalism, of fighting back, of actually being successful in fighting back, that black people in particular, we ended slavery, We ended slavery and black people rose up and revolted against it. We forced this country to change its racist laws in the South. That didn't just happen because some white politician thought it was a good idea. It happened because people struggled against it. So we can change the conditions that exist. But I think that it's critical that we find ways to also to talk to people about these issues, because I think I'll just say, just to slightly disagree with Airickca, but I think black people get enough blame. Parents get enough blame from society at large for things that they have very little control over. And I think that instead of blaming people, we need to fight for the conditions that make it possible for people to do all the things that they that they want to do, and that means fighting for jobs. That means fighting to keep the schools open. And I know people agree with that, but I think that we have to also put that at the center of our struggles. And so I hope people come out for Saturday, stick around to figure out how we can stay connected to each other, and then let's figure out how to get people to Washington, D.C. August 24th.